Welcome, Professor Dershowitz.
Thank you.
Look, Israel continues to poll pretty well in the American public, except for one demographic, and that's the progressives, the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. Have we lost the progressives?
Well, the progressives have abandoned us. The progressives are largely repressives. There's very little progressive about what we see today on college campuses. They want speech codes, they want to bar conservative, Christian, pro-Israel speakers. They are intolerant. The biggest problem that we have today on college campuses, which represents the future, is the extreme left, the intolerant extreme left. They call themselves progressives. I call them regressives, repressives, and we have to make sure that they are marginalized within the mainstream Democratic Party. That's why I threatened to quit the Democratic Party if they elected Keith Ellison, who has close connections to anti-Semitism, close connections to bigotry. Fortunately, he was defeated. He is now the deputy chairman. I have to continue to fight within the left, within the liberal left, because there's an enormous difference between liberals and so-called progressives. And they're hard lines. Bernie Sanders was on Al Jazeera the other day strongly defending Israel. Now, there are those in the Democratic Party, though, who clearly have nothing good to say about Israel. But our job, my job as a liberal Democrat, is to fight within the Democratic Party to keep Israel a bipartisan issue, to make sure that it never becomes, that no election ever becomes a referendum on Israel. Because the one thing about elections, you can lose.
But how do you do that? I mean, we saw in the Democratic, in the primary in New York, that Israel was a big issue between Clinton and Sanders. How do you keep Israel from becoming a partisan issue?
Well, you fight very hard to persuade particularly young people that Israel is consistent with their values. If you're a feminist, you should be a supporter of Israel. Now, the City University of New York, of which I am a proud alum, is having as their graduation speaker at the public health school a bigoted woman who says that you can't be a Zionist and a feminist. Well, I don't think, in fact, you can be a supporter of the causes that she supports and be a real feminist. And I think that we have an obligation not to censor her, because that will fail. That's a tactic that always fails. But when she speaks at the City University graduation, she ought to be leafleted with tens of thousands of leaflets indicating what her real background and what her real program and what her real agenda is. We should use this as an educational moment, as an opportunity to teach young people that they have to oppose bigotry not only on the right but on the left. That opposition to bigotry must also remain a bipartisan issue. You know, too often, people on the right are willing to give a pass to right-wing bigots. They're attacking only left-wing bigots. People on the left are willing to give a pass to left-wing bigots. They attack only right-wing bigots. There is no room for that. Bigotry on both sides must be attacked equally by both sides. Bigotry also, the attack on it must be a bipartisan issue.
Professor Dershowitz, I mean, you're a very strong voice for Israel on the left. Where are the other voices? I mean, Ed Koch died. That was a strong voice. Nobody's coming up.
We have to fight to make sure that people do come up. There are young people. Now, the problem is that there are groups that would like to turn Israel into a right-left issue. Some Jewish groups on the right would like to do that. Some Jewish groups on the left would like to do that. We have to fight it. Ron Lauder made a brilliant opening comment here today in which he talked about unity, in which he talked about emphasizing what brings us together. Look, we're Jews. You have how many hundreds of people in this room? You have that many opinions. You're never going to get unanimity on opinions about Israel. The Bible says we're kshei oref, we're stiff-necked people. We don't easily change our views, but we have to make what I call the 80% case, the case that Herzog and Bennett agree on. And there is a great deal that Herzog and Bennett agree on. They agree that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, that it has the right to defend itself from enemies, that the Iran deal poses great dangers, that the UN resolution was a disaster, that anti-Semitism is growing in many parts of the left. We have to bring people together and de-emphasize the 20% that divides us, particularly now I think there are real opportunities with this new administration to do something constructive in the Middle East. Look, we learned one important lesson, and this was written recently in a book that proved that when the United States has Israel's back, and when Israel feels strong, it is willing to make compromises and concessions. But when it feels that the United States doesn't have its back, it's not willing to make concessions, and that's clear. Under the Obama administration, it was understandably unwilling to make concessions because it did not believe that Obama had Israel's back. On the other hand, when President Clinton was the president, they did believe that President Clinton had Israel's back, and they were prepared to make the peace offer that Ehud Barak made in 2001. Same thing was true with President Bush II. That's when Olmert was prepared to make in 2008 a very generous peace offer. So if you advocate peace, you should be advocating a strong Israel. BDS is anti-peace because it sends a horrible message to the Palestinian leadership that you can get a state without negotiation or compromise. Bringing Israel in front of the International Criminal Court would be against peace because it sends the same message. The message has to be Israel is going to be strong, the United States will have a major and continuing alliance with it, and then Israel can do the right thing based on its own democratic principles, and in the end, how Israel decides to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict will be decided not in Washington, not at the UN, but in Israel itself, because Israel's a democracy.
You mentioned that under President Obama, Israel didn't feel that America had its back,
right.
and as a result wasn't willing to make concessions. We're, 100 and some odd days after Trump's inauguration. What's your initial impressions of his Mideast steps?
Well, there's one thing that's very, very clear about President Trump. He is utterly unpredictable. We do not know what he's going to do next. We don't know what surprises he has up his sleeve when he goes and travels to the Middle East. We didn't know what his approach would be in the recent meeting with Abbas. And unpredictability is a double-edged sword. It may drive people together to try to create predictability from within because they're not getting it from outside, but it may also, because it produces uncertainty, make it more difficult to come to a peaceful resolution. I think we'll know a lot more about what the Trump policy is going to be in the next few weeks. Look, President Obama did not rule by policy. He did not have a policy. He had an ideology. He thought you could rule by ideology. That was a terrible, terrible mistake. His ideology is what led him not to keep his promise about the Syrian weapons of destruction. It's what led him to the Iran deal. It's what led him disgracefully to not veto that horrible UN resolution that basically says that the very Kotel that the previous panel appropriately was arguing over, there's no problem for J Street. There's no argument for J Street about the Kotel. According to J Street, the Kotel doesn't belong to Israel. According to J Street, the Kotel is illegally occupied territory. According to J Street and the Obama administration, the Hebrew University, the Hadassah Hospital, and the Jewish Quarter are not legitimately part of Israel. They're illegally occupied territory. How do you expect to make peace when people are promoting that kind of ahistorical nonsense and that kind of bigotry? And we have to fight it at every turn, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican.
You know, you mentioned the 80% of agreement between between the right and the left, and between Bennett and Bougie. Is there an 80% agreement here among American Jews between J Street and between the ZOA?
Well, it's so interesting. I spoke at the ZOA recently, and I said, this is not a place that Herzl, Ben-Gurion, Henrietta Zoll today would be comfortable at, because the ZOA ought to be an umbrella group that represents all American Zionists. And American Zionists of the center-left and of the left would not feel comfortable at the ZOA. The same thing is true with J Street. An American Zionist, a center-liberal like me, does not feel comfortable at J Street. J Street is not a pro-Israel organization. You cannot be a pro-Israel organization and support the Security Council resolution that declared the essential aspects of Jerusalem are illegally occupied territory. You can't be a pro-Israel organization and represent views that almost no one in Israel supports. So there are limits to what you call a pro-Israel organization, and we'll never get agreement between J Street and the ZOA, but I do think both J Street and the ZOA together represent 20%. And I think the mainstream of 80% Americans fall somewhere in the middle. And whether or not they favor one particular solution or another solution, they want a strong Israel, they want an Israel at peace, they want to see Startup Nation help the world. Look, who can doubt the following statements? No country in the history of the world has ever done more for humanity in the first 69 years of its existence than the State of Israel. When I spoke at the Oxford Union last year against BDS, I challenged the students. I said, name a single country in the world faced with threats comparable to those faced by Israel that has a better record of human rights, higher compliance with the rule of law, and more concern for the lives of enemy civilians. I said, I challenge you, name a country. Not a single person was prepared to get up and name a country in a hostile environment. And in the end, we won the debate against BDS because we were able to persuade open-minded students, the 80% in the middle, that history, morality, justice is on the side of Israel and against BDS. We just have to do a better job.
Thank you, Professor Dershowitz. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.